Gerald Giam.
Question 17, please.
Mr. Speaker, the member asks what differential is applied by the chief valuer to land use for HDB compared to private housing. He goes on to ask whether the private housing land use comparables that are used to value land for HDB BTO flats are based on records of the last transacted private residential land sold by the government and the private parties. Let me explain. The land sold to the private sector for private housing development is typically done by open tender through the Government Land Sales or GLS program. So the value of the land is determined through price discovery as developers bid for the land. On the other hand, sale of state land to HDB for public housing developments does not fall under GLS. Instead, the fair market value that HDB must pay for the purchase of state land for public housing is independently determined by the chief valuer using well-accepted and established valuation principles. Transactions pertaining to land sold for private housing developments are not used to value the land sold to HDB for public housing developments. Instead, the chief valuer considers relevant public housing transactions and the specific parameters of the site. On the differential, which is also the member's question, HDB has publicly stated that the land premium it pays for public housing land parcels is lower than the premiums for equivalent land used for private housing, as observed from the returns of successful tender bids by private developers through GLS. This is in part because of the greater restrictions that apply to public housing, such as buyers' citizenship status, minimum occupation period, income ceiling, non-ownership of private properties, and so on. I must caveat that I'm saying this broadly at the expense of technical accuracy and detail of the work actually done by the chief valuer, which is an independent office. But suffice to say, he adopts the same valuation principles used by professional valuers in the private sector, not just to value private properties, but these principles are also consistent with the principles that other valuers use to value public housing or HDB flats. So when your residents apply for loan, they get a valuation. That's what the valuer does, determine the value of HDB flat. There is such a thing as the value of public housing and public housing land, and it can be ascertained. Relevant to this topic raised by Mr. Giam are the recent comments made by Mr. Leong Man Wai in the public domain, where he said that state land sold to HDB should instead be valued at the historical cost of acquisition, rather than professional valuation principles, which I've just articulated. He argues that by doing so, HDB flats can be made even cheaper than they are. I will leave the point about HDB home pricing and affordability for the debate that we will all be having soon. But we will deal with the point about valuation of land for public housing today. Let me take a bit of time to explain to fellow Singaporeans and members of this House why Mr. Leong's proposal to value state land meant for HDB at historical cost cannot work. First, land has value. Professional valuers in the private sector will tell us that. And actually, all of us intrinsically understand this. So when Mr. Leong calls for land to be sold at historical cost, he is overturning this fundamental point that land has value. Given that most Singaporeans own their homes, he's essentially saying that by a stroke of his pen, a significant portion of the asset value should be ignored. In fact, this was a discussion too that Mr. Cham Si Tong had with then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew back on the 21st of March, 1985 in Parliament, where Mr. Cham was arguing about what the real value of HDB land is and whether it can really be discovered. And after some toing and froing, if you check Hansard, then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew stood up and asked the member squarely. Allow me to quote. Mr. Lee asked, "May I ask whether the member concedes that there is such a concept called, quote, value of land, unquote, and that there is such a profession known in Singapore as a land valuer, that the government has a chief land valuer, that there are in the private sector experts who regularly go to court and give evidence as to what the value of land is, and that the Ministry of National Development, by transferring it from the HDB to the government, is in fact making the books widely known that the value of each plot of land will be determined and is determinable because the land can be used for defense, can be used for schools, can be used for condominiums, it can be used for HDB, it can be used for URA, who's prepared to pay what price for what use. Is there no such concept as value of land?" Unquote. And that, in a way, is a rhetorical question he asked at the end. And after some further exchanges, Mr. Chiam accepts that if that is what the PM says, that is what it says. Perhaps grudgingly, but I think that made the point clear. So that's the first point. Second, when you buy and sell land or property in Singapore, and I would say in many parts of the world, you may often call for a valuation report. And the valuer will usually apply established and accepted valuation principles, accepted by the profession, by the public, to determine current market value. For example, he looks at the relevant recent transactions, makes adjustments for attributes, and so on, and produces a valuation report detailing his grounds. But I don't think you or your professional valuer will base your transaction on how much the property had changed hands back in history. So that's second. Third, the idea of valuing land at historical cost sounds attractive, but is really problematic. If the land was acquired by the government in the 1960s, HDB pays for the land at 1960s pricing. If the land was, say, recently acquired, maybe 2015, then HDB pays the 2015 price, far higher than before. And what if the land had all along been state land and was never acquired by anyone or from anyone? Is the value of the state land at historical cost then zero, i.e. HDB pays zero? Or do we go back to 1819 or thereabouts or further back in time to try to find some historical transactional record that was made and say, that is the price? I think most people will understand why this is wrong. If you want to sell your property today, whether it's HDB flat, condo, terrace house, shop house, or office, you will look at what it is worth in the market today and use that as some basis for you to transact, to bargain, to negotiate. Imagine if someone comes up to you and says point blank, hey, he should really be paying you the historical cost instead of market price, i.e. how much you or your forefathers had paid for it way back in the past. Let's use that as the basis. It's really what it costs to you or your lineage. Or imagine one of our pioneer generation Singaporeans, one of our seniors, maybe in the past earning $500 a month, maybe more, maybe less, and who may have paid, say, $50,000 for his flat back in the early days. Today, because Singapore has done well, thanks to its generation's hard work and contribution, it is certainly worth a lot more. And when you go and do house visits, many seniors tell you proudly they're still living in that flat, but it's worth a lot more. But if we adopt Mr. Leong's new approach, would this senior be required to sell at just above 50,000? Or even with, say, COV, cash over historical value? Would his children and descendants inherit a flat valued as it was back then in the 60s, i.e. worth very little compared to today's prices? We know that Mr. Leong makes a superficially attractive proposition, but we know that the proposal is unfair, is not logical, and simply cannot fly in the face of long-established, well-accepted valuation principles. Fourth, Mr. Leong's valuation approach is actually dangerous for Singapore, because it's really not about valuation principles at all. It sounds like it, but it's not. He is in fact seeking to raid our national reserves in promising you that he can make HDB flats dirt cheap, but better without having to tax Singaporeans more or to find ways to pay for it through revenue sources. As my colleague, Minister Indrani Raja, had explained late last year, state land is part of our national reserves. Quite different from other countries, other provinces, other cities, other districts in other countries which use the sale of state land as a way to fund their recurrent expenditure. State land in our reserves has value. And its value grows if Singapore is well managed and does well. If our reserves are well husbanded and grow, they give greater assurance that our future generation of Singaporeans will have resources to deal with crisis, catastrophe, and calamity, like pandemics, like war, like economic crisis, like climate emergencies. If they grow, they not just benefit the security of our future generations, but they also benefit us today. Well, government cannot touch the proceeds from land sales, which go to the reserves and are then reinvested. Part of the growth in value of our reserves, the NIRC, is used to fund today's needs such as healthcare, housing, subsidies, security, and so on. So when state land is sold to HDB, HDB must put back into the reserves the fair market value of the land, FMV. Turn the land that is in our reserves into its equivalent value of money at this point in time, so the reserves are not worse off, they're not diminished. And that fair market value is determined by professional valuation principles. Mr. Leong's proposal for HDB to pay historical price to the reserves means putting back into the reserves far less than what the state land is really worth today. This is a raid on the reserves, plain and simple, and will diminish the resources available for your children and their children. When Mr. Leong advances his argument, it is about affordable housing, cheap housing. It's about valuation approach. So it's complicated, lots of charts, but the end product is housing will be a lot more cheaper, but hey presto, no need to pay more today by you. He says everything else, but through sleight of hand, he hides from you the plain fact that he is really wanting to raid our reserves. Finally, while I said I would leave the debate on HDB affordability to another time, and as the PSP has said, they will also debate in Parliament on this point, I will just make this final related point for members to consider. We spend considerable amounts of national resources to keep our BTO flats affordable at the house price to income ratios comparable to other countries. You see the stark difference. At the mortgage servicing ratios as they are. Mr. Leong says he can make them even cheaper. They should be, he says. But to do this, there's one way. Cut back on other government expenditure, whether it's healthcare, security, education. What do you want to trim back so that you spend more on this? Or by raising revenues through taxation or through other means, so that he can deliver on even cheaper BTOs. But this is not going to be popular or wearable. So instead, the approach is a populist one. Raid our reserves, but don't say it. And he says governments sell land to HDB at distant historical costs, ignore market valuation principles. So Singaporeans today get dirt cheap housing without having to pay more taxes or experience cutbacks elsewhere to pay for this. Get the benefit of the cake and eat it. As DPM Lawrence Wong had said previously in a debate on the GST and on many other occasions, if you want to tap more on the reserves, diminish it, use more of it for today and leave less for tomorrow, let's just say it plainly, let Singaporeans see it as it is, and we can have a debate come the next round when we talk about housing, about reserves, about expenditure, about sustainability. Then we can have a sound, fair basis for discussion. But the point that he's made, the argument he's proposing, the proposition he's making, I think most people will recognize that this deal sounds too good to be true.
Mr. Gerald Gim.
I thank the Minister for his reply to my question. Will the high resale prices that we have seen in recent years push up the value of BTO flats and impact the price that Singaporeans pay for their BTO flats? Or does HDB increase subsidies to completely offset the increase in land valuation due to this factor? That's my first question. Second, SQ is the chief valuer's decision on the valuation of a piece of land has a great impact on the amount that Singaporeans have to pay for their HDB flats. How does the government ensure that in practice, that the chief valuer is able to make his valuation decisions completely independently and that no one attempts to influence his decisions? Thank you.
First, let me put it beyond any shadow of doubt. The office of the chief valuer is independent, is in the Constitution. His powers, his protection are set out in law. And that answers his second question clearly. Presidential protection on the office of the chief valuer. Second, the member asks how to ensure that the chief valuer's valuations don't overly impact the cost of BTO flat prices. We've explained previously that HDB does not price HDB flats to recover the cost of land and construction. Now, I think the member may be thinking about what the private sector does. Private sector bids for a piece of land. It has to be very careful how much it bids for. It then says, okay, let me call my consultant, contractor. These are the costs of development. And then let me price my per square foot, or let me price my units in order to recover my costs and also to make an overhead, to make a profit. That must be it, right? Profit-driven private sector. But I've said, and my colleagues and my predecessors have said, we do not price HDB flats to recover costs of land and construction. If it were so, then when the land and construction price fluctuates, and in some parts, some time in our history, including the last 2 years, these prices fluctuate a lot. Material prices fluctuate a lot. Labor costs fluctuate. Land costs has gone up quite a bit because of the pandemic. If it were so, then wouldn't you see the BTO prices shooting up? In fact, the average price of four-room non-mature estate flats has remained fairly constant. The average price has remained fairly constant before the pandemic in 2019 and last year, despite the resale market having gone up 28 to 29%. Why is that so? First, we do not price HDB flats to recover costs of land and construction, and that is why HDB collects far less than the cost it has to pay out. And the deficit has been growing, especially the last 2 years. So that is first and foremost the fallacy in the member's question, and I hope that by this explanation you understand how it's done. I go to your first question is, you ask how do you ensure that resale price increases in the last 2 years do not overly push up BTO prices? I think what I've just explained answers that. In order to keep prices of BTO prices, in order to keep the price of BTO flats relatively stable, despite all these resale price increases, yes, we look at transactions of resale flats that are comparable, but then we have to apply the appropriate subsidies and grants in order to bring down these costs to an affordable level for Singaporeans. And that is why year from year, launch from launch, these have to be adjusted because of location, because of resale prices, to ensure that relative stability in the BTO market prevails. We can have further debate on this when the PSP and the government debate this, and we welcome the WP to participate as well.
Leader of Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just following up from Minister's point on subsidies, I filed a written question for yesterday's session inquiring the dollar value of subsidies allocated by HDB in each year from 2010 to 2022 for HDB BTO apartments in both mature and non-mature estates respectively, and how many of such flats were constructed each year. And Minister replied saying that the market subsidies are not directly comparable across projects, launches and years, as they depend on prevailing market conditions, attributes of the BTO projects offered and prevailing household incomes. I understand that answer, but Minister, in his reply, did not set out the subsidies for each year. And I cannot understand why that information cannot be made public, because those subsidies are taxpayer subsidies. The taxpayer is actually funding the home ownership program vis-a-vis subsidies. And I need the minister's understanding as to why that information cannot be given out by the ministry.
I think we can deal with this more thoroughly in a debate on the motion, but the short answer is that if you look at every brochure when we have a launch, and I'm sure the member has got residents come up to you to say, which one, 3-room, 4-room, which floor? And you look at the BTO range of prices, we made the effort to put the comparable resale price next to it. That is a sense of the whole range, broadly, the whole range of market support and subsidies that are given to Singaporeans. But we have to bear in mind that based on each family's circumstances, additional grants may or may not be available. And so it will vary, not just project by project, but also on who buys them. So not just subsidies, but also grants. And we have provided the cost of construction, which is put out and published. The overall amount of money that government uses as taxpayer dollar to fund home ownership is public information. It's a huge figure with some breakdown. And we also put it in the brochure, not just for members of parliament, but for individual buyers, to get a sense of the range of difference between the resale prices that are comparable and the prices that they are being asked to pay in a range, again, different floor, different facing, different block. And of course, as I said before, the subsidies that we provide on top of the grants will vary from launch to launch, from year to year, even within the same town, because, and especially when resale prices fluctuate a lot. I mean, when everything is flat, roughly it's all about the same. But just think about it. You have resale prices shooting up 28 to 9% in the last 2 years. I may be getting my figures a bit wrong, but broadly, the resale prices have gone up a lot. But look at the average resale price, average BTO prices. They've remained relatively stable, of course, adjusting for different locations. And that must mean that you have to adjust the subsidies, even for projects launched in succession in an area, in order to ensure that stability.
Ms. Jessica Tan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to just ask Minister a supplementary question as we talk about valuation of BTO and its impact on BTO prices. As we know, because of the current situation on supply, it is also affecting the affordability of resale, even for first-time homeowners is a question. So how can we also assure people, if BTO is not an option and they are going in the resale market, that it's still affordable, especially for first-time homeowners?
We all recognize that resale prices have gone up, and the reasons for this have been articulated before. And that is why, amongst other things, we have made 2 rounds of cooling measures to moderate demand. We are also mindful of the headwinds that may come our way this year. Economic headwinds, geopolitical, very high mortgage interest rates. So I think all in, let's keep an eye on the resale market, both private and HDB. People are being rather prudent and careful as they should be. There are macroprudential rules to constrain overstretching. And if you've read news articles at the early part of this year, there have been reports that suggest that the property market is stabilizing. Now, it may be too early to draw definitive conclusions, but our overriding objective is to ensure stability in the property market, to ensure it doesn't run away from economic fundamentals. And so I think that's important. And on top of that, we continue to study how to ensure that both BTO and the resale market continue to remain affordable for different groups of Singaporeans at different income levels. And that study continues.
Speaker, I would like to ask the Minister one question. Actually, I'm not sure. When did I mention that HDB prices should be priced based on historical cost of land? Where did I write? I think I did mention that.
There was an exchange between the Honourable Member and Senior Minister of State Siman last year, and further Facebook and social media posts. I think we leave that for the debate. If the member tells us that he does not think government should charge HDB historical prices, then I think that advances the discussion.